Amy DiPlacido is an independent curator and artist. I met Amy when she was working at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, where she was the curator of exhibitions for 6 years, from 2016 to 2022. She started out as she started her career in museums at the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, where she was a coordinator of a makerspace. And she received her MFA in fibers from Cranbrook Academy of Art and her BFA from Massachusetts College of Art and Design. So we are delighted to have Amy come back. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. And thank you again to Devin and Ruby, our sponsors, and San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles for having me today. And if you didn't see me present yesterday, my talk is around 45 minutes long, and hopefully we'll have 15 minutes Q&A and discussion time at the end. I will be working with well-known works from art history, artists that I've actually had the opportunity to work with personally at San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, and also the pieces from the permanent collection of the museum, and that has an emphasis on textiles from Northern California. And my fun fact is, as a child, my friend and I once met Alice Cooper at a Halloween night, not really knowing that he was the godfather of heavy metal music. And we waited in line anyways. And I asked for his autograph, but the only paper that I had in my backpack was Lisa Frank rainbow paper. So I like to think that I was making interesting juxtapositions even as a child. So yesterday we covered themes from English language arts, and today we'll be diving into history and social sciences. You remember that yesterday we started with the bio tapestry, which is perhaps one of the first documented examples of storytelling that is still preserved today. But the bio tapestry could have just as easily been presented today under the theme of history. And in fact, in thinking through my presentations, there are many examples of me getting really excited about a topic, then thinking, wait, what topic does that support best? English, history, or social justice? And as you educators understand, probably more than anyone else, it's all interrelated. One of the easiest entry points into textiles is clothing. And what inner child isn't fascinated by armor? And admittedly, when talking about textiles, armor may not be the first word that comes to mind. Let's take a look at some examples today. On the left, we see a quilted medieval textile. Let's see here. In the middle, we have fabric armor and helmet with Buddhist symbols dating to the 18th century. And on the right, there's the quilted Mysorean armor from the 18th century. In each of these examples, the quilted armor generally consists of an envelope of fabric that is stuffed with shock-absorbing padding, which is then stitched in place. The material is thick enough to absorb a blow while still allowing relative freedom of movement. For the medieval gambeson left, we see an armored jacket made of many layers of linen, around 32 layers. Sometimes the linen would get soaked in red wine and salt, where the salt fills the small pores of the linen, and the mixture helps harden the fabric. Sometimes this would also be made out of wool, and in the medieval era, wool cloth was produced locally and virtually in every region, with robust trade throughout Europe, so it was readily available. In the middle example from the 18th century Korea, the tunic is composed of 30 layers of a tough cotton fabric, skillfully cut and sandwiched together with hemp stitching to give an overall thickness of less than 1 inch. The armor is spiritually augmented by a series of protective Taoist and Buddhist symbols seen here on the torso. The helmet is quilted in a conventional manner and reinforced by a finial with 4 radiating bands made of iron. Finally, the peti, or quilted armor on the right, is from the 18th century in Mysore, who had a lot of Muslim and North Indian influence despite it being from South India. The helmet is made with leather covered in compressed layers of fabric and lined in crimson silk. The metal nasal piece on this armor is evidence of its Islamic origin and influence. The cuirass, or breastplate, is constructed of compressed thick layers of coarse fabric lined in striped polychrome silk. And the dastana, or arm guards, are padded with dark brown velvet lining, faced in bright red velvet. In researching these, I thought, who knew fabric armor could be so beautiful? And of course, horses need armor too. This colorful equestrian figure is an accurate reconstruction of a German jouster circa 1500. The horse wears a blind chevron or head defense with the eyes covered to prevent it from shying away from the encounter. Similarly, a collar of bells muffled the noise of the oncoming horse and roaring crowd. The horse is fitted with a straw-filled bolster hung across the chest that acts like a bumper to protect the horse and the rider's legs in the event of a collision. This was necessary in a joust fought in an open field, which lacked a barrier to keep the horses separated. A gosoku is a complete set of armor in Japan, seen to the right. Samurai armor consisted of an iron and breastplate on the front, and surprisingly contains a wide variety of cotton and silk fabrics, as well as hide and leather. The set consists of a helmet, and within the helmet, a half mask, the front crest of the wearer's clan, shoulder guards, sleeves, and a skirt. Now, to transition to textile mills in America, I'm sure you're familiar with the textile industry in Lowell, Massachusetts, but it's worth mentioning today in today's theme of textiles and history. In 1813, the Boston Manufacturing Company was formed as the first integrated textile factory, which performed every function necessary to turn raw cotton into finished cloth. This made the Lowell mills truly unique in that the entire manufacturing process happened under one roof. Working in difficult conditions, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, the young women had to adhere to a strict moral code and curfew, but it was still better than the physical labor of working on the family farm. Textile corporations recruited women from New England farms and villages. These, quote, daughters of Yankee farmers, had few economic opportunities, and many were enticed by the prospect of monthly cash wages and room and board in a comfortable boarding house, as well as the opportunity to socialize with other young women. In the bottom image, we see the process of kissing the shuttle. A shuttle is used to carry the weft thread across the loom in the process of weaving cloth. When the bobbin was replaced, weavers sucked or kissed the thread through the eye of the shuttle to feed through the loose ends. Nowadays, we know that this process would be unsanitary, but it actually spread tuberculosis in the mills in its heyday. When the source was found, the state enacted law, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Acts of 1911, Chapter 281, and acts to prohibit the use of suction shuttles in factories. Weavers were given a small metal hook to replace the action and were fined if caught doing it, quote, the good old way. And here's a restored Lowell mill today. By the 1830s, Lowell and its mill girls became fairly famous. In the mid-1840s, the Lowell workers organized the Female Labor Reform Association, which tried to bargain for improved wages. But the Lowell system of labor was essentially undone by increased immigration to the United States. Part of the American manufacturing story is showing how humans were replaced by technological ability. Artist Carole Frances Lung's piece, Frau Fiber versus the Circular Knitting Machine, comically plays in live time the 4-hour-long competition between her persona, Frau Fiber, and industrial production. By the end of the 4 hours, she has successfully knitted a single sock, while her competitor, the knitting machine, has made 99 pairs. Carole purposely films in black and white and seeks permission to film at factories, so she can have a true test of the human versus the machine, reminding us of the story of John Henry. I think this social practice artwork, she asked these questions. What does it look like to be a conscientious consumer? And how do we change the path of fast fashion to be more humane and sustainable? And we were really happy to have 3 of these videos on view during my time at San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. Because our museum is located in the heart of Silicon Valley, I'd be remiss if I didn't lightly touch upon the connection of jacquard weaving and computing. The jacquard loom was invented in 1804 and transformed how detailed patterned cloth could be woven quickly. Now that it could be mass produced, it was affordable to a wide market of consumers and less artisanal and specialized. The jacquard's invention was its use of interchangeable cards upon which small holes were punched, which held instructions for weaving a pattern. These punch cards represented a revolution in human-machine interaction and its use of binary code, zeros and ones, inspiring the blueprint of early computers. In creating the precursor to the computer, it was envisioned that a machine could receive instructions from punch cards to carry out mathematical calculations, which led to the technological development of the modern day computer. And now to transition into some pieces from the permanent collection of San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. Machine pieced, hand embroidered, and tied, this cigarette quilt, tobacco premium quilt, is dated to be around 1910. It is made from silk ribbons that cigarette manufacturers included in their packaging. The pieced silk rectangles of blue and red are interspersed with tobacco premiums, off-white silk with flags of all different nations printed onto them. This reflects the time of merchandising of tobacco, which included cigar ribbons, cigarette silks, and cigar flannels. Quilts made from these fabrics reflect the importance of home decoration during the Victorian times. They also suggest the impact of tobacco usage on late Victorian and early 20th century society. The seams have been embroidered with feather stitch, and the piece tops have been backed with solid blue silk. It makes me think of the people who smoke these cigars and cigarettes and the conversations around them, but they could be a great exercise for identifying the different countries' flags and how they might have changed in the last century. Another work from the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles collection, Marion Literia is known for her mixed media works that incorporate artifacts once central to daily rituals and work routines. The resulting compositions explore the human experience. The artist values the narratives of the past that these objects hold, bringing a contemporary audience to their forebears by exploring cultural shifts and community ties. In Old Glory, artist Marion Literia gives new life to the iconic stars and stripes of the American flag. She used a hand-quilted denim utility quilt made by her grandmother, Carrie Martin, in South Carolina around the time of the Great Depression as the base. She added women's white gloves and an eclectic collection of red pincushions to complete the image. Through her choice of materials may be a bit surprising, Literia pays tribute to women's work from Betsy Ross to today's fiber artists. The use of the objects connected to sewing and handiwork underscores the gender inequality that has long plagued our country. And here's a quote from the artist. Using found objects, ephemera, and mundane artifacts of life, I create artworks that evoke a sense of who we are and how we have lived. By transforming forgotten cast-offs into purposeful imagery and connecting disparate elements to make new realities, viewers are asked to see things in a new way and connect with their own personal memories. This piece gives tribute to the women of humble origins who built a mighty republic. They were self-sacrificing homemakers with can-do attitudes and a great deal of moral fiber. They knew how to make something out of nothing. While altering this simple and honest piece of American folk art, I thought about those strong, hardworking women of an earlier age. Old glory indeed. And to this day, this is one of our most popular pieces in the SJMQT collection because no one has ever seen anything quite like it. So many people want to take a selfie with it. When I think about the audience's interests, I think people feel the presence of many generations of loving hands through these found objects. And now moving on to another San Jose contemporary artist, Ryan Carrington. In the last decade, Carrington has created large-scale installations of fiber art and multimedia works inspired by American industry with a focus on how the country spends its work and leisure time. Juxtaposing tools and materials of white and blue-collar workers, Carrington prompts the questions about how our country values labor and class divisions and how workers strive for the American dream. As a meditation on the value of labor in the United States, Carrington's recent flag series reproduces sewn American flags in the same dimensions to the congressional standard. The garments were collected over years, asking workers to donate their clothes once discarded. Carrington then composed the flags to include a variety of careers within each arrangement: painter's pants, jeans, Carhartt, cotton duck canvas, collared shirts, suits, and neckties. In these sewn assemblages, the artist highlights irregularities in his surface material, such as paint splatters, pen markings, and sweat under the collar. These idiosyncrasies in cloth allow the viewer to wonder about the wearer's personalities, their histories, and the labor exerted by the wearer. It was only when the shelter-in-place order kept Carrington working from home on his dining room table that he decided to create the flag series using pre-worn uniforms. Flag number 19 was created solely from the dress of healthcare providers, alternating white and blue colors, leaving in defining features such as the drawstring and cording of scrubs. The finished results pay homage to the bravery of frontline workers during a time when healthcare was pushed to the limits amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Carrington's intention was that the sewn flags celebrate pride of the American workforce, conjuring camaraderie and reflection as one union, a glimmer of hope that was needed at the height of the pandemic. I think they remind us of how the pandemic exposed deep inequities and how the country values labor, time, and physical work. Eye of the Rice, Yu Mai Gi Fon, is a visual homage to the artist's immigrant parents. This work narrates Wang's father's near-fatal shooting in April of 1940. After the shooting, her mother dashed out of the house to pursue the assailant, and two men who overheard the ordeal captured the shooter. Around that time, Wang's family did not have rice for their meals. Relatives donated sacks of rice so that they could survive. 45 years later, Wang started this autobiographical work composed of cloth rice, sacks, beads, sequins, thread, and other materials to honor her parents' courage to persevere. A quote from the artist: "In 1986, I met the sculptor Ruth Asawa. I was inspired by her wire sculpture dangling from the ceiling in her San Francisco home. Filled with creative energy when I returned home, I pulled out my collection of cloth rice sacks to cut and sew compulsively. I worked for 4 years before I understood that I was retrieving the history of her father's shooting. In my studio, I heard my mother's voice. Her spirit guided me as I hand sewed this immensely personal work of art." Conceptually, Wang intended this piece as a tribute to Chinese immigrants and their contributions to California through work in the gold rush and railroad, and dedicated to the memory of Asian Americans who have been victims of hate crimes. Through her artistic career, Floy Oi Wong has been exploring rice as a vehicle to express the metaphors of, quote, sticking together, and as a staple of her American and Chinese identity. Deeds Not Words, celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage, is a digital exhibition that we launched during COVID when our museum was closed. And you can still find it on the Museum from homepage on the SJMQT website. This show was curated by Sandra Sider, curator of the Texas Quilt Museum, and Pamela Weeks, curator of the New England Quilt Museum. Emmeline Parkhurst, the famously militant British suffragist in 1903, coins the motto, "Deeds, not words," for the newly formed Women's Social and Political Union. History proved that while rhetoric was the impetus for radical change, actions were needed to finalize steps towards ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The suffragists were true revolutionaries, occasionally sacrificing their reputations and sometimes their freedom. Katie Stanton was one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention held in New York in 1848. There, before a meeting, a declaration of sentiments was drafted, which included issues about rights denied to women, like owning property and equal pay for equal work. However, women's voting rights was not one of the issues, but it is still considered a founding document for suffrage in this country. Frederick Douglass was in attendance and signed the Declaration of Sentiments. 100 years later, a postage stamp, seen here, was issued to commemorate these heroines as leaders of the Women's Rights Convention. Here we see that. Jill Kurtula's unique quilt reminds us that Belva Lockwood in 1884 ran for president, even though she herself was not permitted to vote. During Hillary Clinton's run for president in 2016, the artist learned that Hillary was actually not the first woman to run for president. In 1884, at age 53, before women had the right to vote, Belva Lockwood ran a nationwide campaign as a presidential candidate for the Equal Rights Party. As she said in one interview, "I cannot vote, but I can be voted for." As the first woman allowed to practice at the bar of the Supreme Court, she knew the constitutionality of her endeavor. There had been other fledgling campaigns supported by suffragists and prohibition groups, but none with the reach, support, and credibility of Belva Lockwood. Several of the artists, in Deeds Not Words, chose to celebrate a suffragist whose name they remembered from history lessons, while others felt a more personal relationship with their subjects. Arturo Alonso Sandoval, for example, was inspired by a friend who is the daughter of an African-American suffragist. From the artist, quote, "Researching suffragist Ethel Williams of Detroit, Michigan, led me to discover many women of African-American descent who participated in the women's suffrage movement. I felt compelled to include many of these women who were forgotten due to the racism of the time. Since Black suffragists were not given their rightful place among the main women's suffrage movement marches, I chose to include as many as I could in this memorial quilt, paying homage to their valiant efforts and helping push through the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution." And then for those of you in attendance yesterday, I mentioned that I would use the work of Alexander Hernandez to tie all three presentations together. Hernandez is a San Francisco-based artist who explores gender, immigration, and cultural assimilation. As a self-identified queer artist coming from an immigrant background, Hernandez references those experiences through his work using needlework, DIY craft, and traditional techniques. His patchworking of domestic fabrics, digitized prints, cultural textiles, and pop cultural artifacts create Frankensteinian-like works that embrace layers and patterns. This particular piece was created from found pillowcases, bed sheets, denim, and other cast-off fabrics and scraps. Let's see if I can play a video here so you can hear from the artist himself.
The piece that I made for them, which kind of is kind of like an homage to these different sculptures that you'll see in Mexico that are kind of, for example, like, you know, like multiple faces. And so I kind of wanted to show that in the piece on the left, Three Faces of a Boy, because they all have to do, it's kind of like a self-portrait, I guess, but also I think kind of a portrait of a lot of Latinos that grew up in the United States that maybe grew up here, but then going back home, they don't feel like they belong there either. Maybe their Spanish is not that great. So I wanted to create this kind of like Frankenstein portrait of like all these things that that we're made out of. So like, I mean, obviously the middle fabric is like the Mexican sarape fabric. And then you have like the plaid on the side. That like plaid for me was like was a pattern that I saw everywhere in the US. But also I would see, I mean, it's kind of a global fabric now. And then I was also interested in, I started to collect also like children bed sheets at this time. Like I started collecting like nostalgic childhood fabrics, bed sheets, pillowcases, things that I kind of grew up with that I'm like, that I would find at thrift stores. And I just remember thinking like, oh, wow, I remember this. And it also, I didn't realize that like even things like that, like nostalgic items, domestic items, kind of help shape my identity as well. The piece that I made for them, which kind of is kind of like an
Great. So you get to hear a little bit from the artist, Alexander Hernandez. And he was actually part of the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles Artist in Residence program in April through June of 2019. His work combines multiple identities and narratives with his Oaxacan roots, queer sensibilities, and pop culture. This piece is not only in SJMQT's permanent collection, but it's also in the 45th anniversary exhibit, which is on view right now and highlights acquisitions made to the permanent collection in the last 5 years. So I'm not sure if anybody is local to the Bay Area, but of course, you can see this on view right now. The Dinner Party by Judy Chicago is an icon of feminist art, which represents 1,038 women in history. 39 women are represented by place settings, and another 999 names are inscribed in the heritage floor on which the table rests. You kind of see that right here. This tribute to women includes individual place settings for such luminary figures such as Emily Dickinson, Joan of Arc, Sojourner Truth, and Sacagawea. Each place setting has an exquisitely embroidered table runner that includes the name of the woman, utensils, a goblet, and a plate, as you can see with the example of Virginia Woolf here. The dinner party is also a product of the volunteer labor of more than 400 people and is a testament to the power of feminist vision and artistic collaboration. And today it lives at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. The International Honor Quilts is a collaborative grassroots feminist art project initiated by Judy Chicago in 1980 to, quote, extend the spirit of the dinner party. It consists of a collection of 539 individual quilts that can be assembled into a multi-sectional monumental work of art. The panels, which utilize wide variety of materials and techniques, have been made by different women or groups honoring and addressing individually selected women. women's organizations, or women's issues to expand the number of women honored by Chicago's The Dinner Party. The IHQ, or International Honor Quilts, was gifted to the University of Louisville and its Height Art Institute in October 2013. Panels were added to the quilt at each venue it traveled to, beginning in 1980 and continuing through 1988. And anyone could add to this. So for example, there are workshops and people could make their triangle, and it could be somebody that you wanted to honor, like your aunts, for example, or here you can see that there's one for Mother Teresa. So whether they're famous or somebody familiar to you, you could make something and then add it to this project that is now in the permanent collection. And I'll just leave you with a thought that artists' role in society is to constantly be looking both forward and backward, using history as inspiration to bring forward new ideas for a resilient future. And if anything, I hope that this put some interesting artists on your radar. And just want to thank you guys for being here today on your summer vacation. And yeah, I'd like to open it up to any discussions and Q&A time now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Amy. So does anybody have any questions? You can unmute or put it in the chat. There were a couple other comments from before. We'll get back to those later. I'm wondering, Amy, if you can tell us a little bit more about Ryan Carrington, since he's local.
Sure.
He's local to us.
Let me see if I can go back here to Ryan's work. But let's see, can you see this chat that I have in the middle of my screen?
No.
Okay, I was just starting to read the chat, but I can see it, but you guys can't, which is great. So
the piece that I made for them, which
let me find Ryan's. So I think starting with here. Yeah, so this is the beginning of Ryan Carrington's work, and he was actually an artist in residence at the Quilt and Textile Museum. And one artist had to leave, after a quick amount of time and couldn't finish the residency. And we made a quick call to Ryan and said, could you spend 2 months working and creating at our museum and interacting with the public? And he said, yes. So this is just one series of his work called the Flag series. I would encourage you guys just to look at his website, especially if you are Santa Clara County based or San Jose based, if you want to highlight a local artist. He's really wonderful, and he also works at Santa Clara University. You can see here that he's using what I think are the tie fabric, like a men's tie, that he's cutting out and then placing it on a white colored shirt here. So that's just a detail of this larger piece here, but then he'll juxtapose that with something like what you might associate with physical labor, like Carhartt is a big brand that he uses in his work as his construction material to create these flags. And then moving on, we have this. So interestingly, Ryan Carrington received this kind of garbage bag full of nurses' scrubs and doctors' white coats. And the nice part about being an artist is sometimes you just need to sit with the materials for a little bit and think on how the inspiration will come to you. And it really wasn't until all the news, like if you can rewind and think back to the beginning of the pandemic, when there was a lot of stress on doctors and nurses, still in the beginning where they were asking for masks. I think that Ryan started to think a little bit more about how can he pay his respects to this field of workers and still be true to his body of artwork too. And then he was reminded that he had this basically a garment bag of all these pieces. And finally, the inspiration kind of clicks for him. And he started to make two flags, flag 19 and 20, where it's completely nurses and doctors uniforms. And I think that it made us think about our values and our labor in America in a unique way. Another point that I'll just make about his work too is that he takes the congressional standard. So the size of the stripe is the same as the American flag. The stars are the same size. The overall length and width are the same as the American flag. The only thing that's different is this, are the materials that it's made up in. And whenever we think about quilting, I'm sure you guys talked about the quilting, the textile sandwich yesterday, and I have referenced it in my last talk too, that this is actually just the quilt's top, which is the top of the flag that you see. And then there's just a very simple backing. So it doesn't have that batting in the middle. So I would call this a quilt, although it doesn't have that like padded feeling in the middle too. And I'm not sure if it's really quilted all the way through. I think it's just kind of one piece of fabric on the top, one piece of fabric in the bottom. And he has made, I think, over 20 of these flags now, and we honored that artwork in a recent solo exhibit at SJMQT called Contradictions, which is, you know, why I am familiar with his work so much.
And I think, you know, you mentioned that he teaches at Santa Clara University, and I think that's a great thing about him as an artist, is that he's also an educator. He's also taught at San Jose State University. He's given lectures in different places. So he's really willing to share and talk about his work. And I think that's a great example of an inspiration about that type of artist. You know, yesterday I mentioned Butler, who was a high school teacher for 13 years before she sort of hit it big. And so good connections between artists and educators.
Yeah, and like while, you know, at Santa Clara University, he is given an artist studio, but he had to basically transform his body of work, which is, I would say, like very sculptural and like very much with tools to be like, how do I create a softer body of artwork that I can make at home with two kids? So I think that's why this is the right project and the right body of work to work on for the time here. And he, I think, like many educators here, has gone through the experience of teaching art on Zoom at the even at the college level. And I remember talking to him like, how do you even start to teach like ceramics or welding from home? But we all persevered. And I think that harkens back to this flag series where everybody didn't know how they survived, but we did.
I think the other interesting thing is taking something, as you mentioned, the standard, so he's limited himself in some ways with these parameters that he's going to make these flags to the same specifications as a standard flag. And yet he's able to create these things like I actually, and this is probably because I'm looking at them online, you know, I can't tell they're all even the same proportion. Part of that, I think, is that optical illusion, depending on the colors he's used and things like that. And also part of it's the fact that I'm looking at them online, so they're all slightly different sizes. But I didn't notice that right away. So to me, that's interesting to have a set of parameters, and yet still within that set of parameters, still be able to be as creative as he can be and come up with all these different ideas about how to use these materials and convey a message.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of artists might feel counterintuitive, but a lot of artists use those parameters to give creative like strength and kind of guidelines to their art projects too. I will mention that Carrington made his largest work for our museum, which was, I'm not sure if you remember it, Ruby, but there was, I think, I'm going to say like a 17-foot long flag, but it started out on the wall and it looked like the American flag hung vertically. And then as it came down the wall, it spilled out onto a picnic table that he actually created. And then it kind of morphed into the picnic tablecloth that you might associate with the gingham print. So like kind of turned into like red, white, and pink squares at the bottom. And that was a fascinating conversation too, because it's maybe the idyllic version of America. But when we think about the labor and how hard we all work, there's really no time to go on picnics anymore, at least maybe speaking for myself here, but kind of harkens back to a time where there's just more leisure crafts, like people are part of bowling leagues, for example, and just had this time that could be balanced with a full-time job. Now it seems like everybody is hustling for like a side project or freelance here. And then another topic that came up in that creation of work was that during the pandemic, lumber prices just skyrocketed. So he was, budgeting out like artists budget work, and Santa Clara University was giving him a material stipend so that he could work a little bit on this project. And when he budgeted lumber like pre-pandemic versus in the middle, he realized that, he had to pay like $200 or $300 more for the same amount of lumber. So I know it's that problem of inflation that we are also all dealing with too, but it really speaks to the times of America, past and present. So I think that, this is just a really wonderful project. And again, I would encourage you guys to look online because he has a fascinating project using like Burberry textile, the high-end fashion plaid that you might see on like sweaters and bags. Burberry is kind of known for their tan, black, and red plaid, but he has recreated that with products that he can find at Home Depot. So he used the same color screws that you could get in the hardware aisle, and he actually drilled in the screws at varying heights, so it kind of resembled these high-end fashion brands. So also kind of an interesting project to look up.
Yes, so, like you were saying before, this link between all of these different, how these things overlap. I was talking about history and connections to history, but also talking about social justice issues, which you'll be talking about more tomorrow. But I think what's also really interesting just in general about the items that you've shown is the link between contemporary art and the past, especially when you're talking about Hernandez.
Oh, Alexander Hernandez.
Alexander, sorry. Alexander Hernandez, linking his heritage and updating, clearly in his, it's not just coincidental. He has this in his mind. This is familiar territory for him. He remembers these objects. These are historic objects. They're rooted in his culture, and then he's updating them to his current situation, and he's still referencing the past. So I think that's a really interesting thing about so many contemporary artists, that they do understand history, or at least they're connecting to certain parts of history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to remember art is not made in a vacuum. It's influenced by all aspects of life and history. And I love the juxtaposition of these two slides together. And I did try to find a little bit more information on this, but other than in his talk that he mentioned that it was, I think, Mexican carved stone, I didn't know. So I'd be curious if anyone from the group has seen this before, but I myself was not familiar, but I'm also coming from a textile background with this, but you can readily see the connections of kind of the metaphors of having different personalities within yourself, but just also the physical structure of this, of having the 4 eyes here and kind of the 3 noses. So how this just kind of works, and I think speaks to his identity of being Mexican born, but finding identity through his many aspects of his contemporary American life.
Mhm.
Amy, this
sorry,
may
go ahead.
be,
Oh,
was
yeah.
someone else asking a question? Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Devin.
Okay, I'm just wondering, and this may be too broad of a question, but thinking about textiles as a lens of understanding kind of our past and history, can you sort of think about what it is that's unique about textiles that offers lenses that perhaps other forms of historical sources and evidence don't? And maybe that's more of a question from an historian perspective, but I'm wondering from your involvement with the textiles, how you kind of view that.
Yeah, and that's, certainly a loaded question that we'd spend all day discussing, but I'll definitely share what I know and what I think in terms of the different lenses of textiles. So I think everybody knows that it's like probably the most readily apparent medium in their home, and it's also very comforting. And I think we all have an association or memory of how the tactile qualities of textiles have changed us. We all have experienced our most vulnerable moments, around cloth, to either being swaddled as a baby or laying down, feeling comfortable on a bed. And it's also where most intimate moments lie, I think. And in relating to why textiles has really had a renaissance, or kind of keeps going through these different renaissances, I think about textiles more through a contemporary lens. And thinking about my own experience, we have all probably of the age where we experienced 9/11. And a lot of people were really afraid to leave their homes after that, with a threat of domestic or foreign terrorism. And so I think that prompted us to look inward towards the home a little bit. And we found the table runners and the fabric napkins and pillowcases, and we started to get a little bit more creative. Whereas you can't really have that same sort of association with craft and material if you're looking at ceramics and metals. Nothing against them, those mediums. I love them personally, but you might not be able to just, whip up a welding machine and like learn how to do that in your garage. But textiles, it's like, it doesn't take up a lot of space. You can do it on your couch. It's ready familiar. And it's all around your house too. So you kind of have the most easy entry point, if you will. And then in the 2008, 2009 recession, I think people were really interested in sewing again, because people were going through a hard time economically, and people were learning how to mend their clothes. And they're also looking for activities that they could do at home that didn't cost money. And then finally, I think with COVID, we've seen quilting just really skyrocket into something that maybe was a luxury or a leisure activity. Because when you think about quilters, they maybe have an extra bedroom in their house, or you need a machine, or you need the ironing, you need space for an ironing board and an iron. But I think people kind of realized that anybody who had a needle and thread could hand sew, and everybody had recycled garments that they could work into a textile project. And suddenly I think people realized that they were looking for things to do while they were binge watching TV. And I think that's why we have seen a couple of different textile activities really just transform in the last 2 years. Quilting, I think, is one of them. And then I'm not sure if you guys know tufting, but I think that a lot of people got really into using a tufting gun, or kind of crochet or knitting, embroidery. I think all those things we have at home, or maybe we inherited them and we were cleaning out our houses and realized that we had, maybe something left over from a hotel. We had a sewing kit, and so that we could utilize that sewing kit. So that's kind of how I think of the popularity of textiles. And then of course it kind of came through in waves with the 1970s and the feminist movement there. I think that really laid a foundation for it being a medium that is taught in academia. And I think that a lot of artists, as they interpret that medium today, you can easily pick up the techniques where a lot of artists just say that they're artists. A lot of people are dropping the, well, I'm a textile artist or I'm a fiber artist. A lot of people are just saying, okay, the medium of using textiles is the thing that conceptually represents the best idea for me. Maybe they want to talk about softness or vulnerability, or in Alex Hernandez's case, having many sides to one's personality. And they feel that fabric is a very forgiving material to work through those concepts and through the process of fiber. So I hope that answers your question, thinking about the lens of textiles and what has really happened in the last 30 or 40 years in regards to understanding textiles and taking it more seriously as a craft and art form.